Hello, this is Ukla with Lyudmila Nemeria, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And today we have a very special guest. Our guest today is James Sherr. James Sherr is a Honorary Fellow in International Center for Defense and Security. He is also an Associated Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program of Chatham House. And of course, for over 25 years, James Sherr has been regularly consulted by Western governments on the foreign defense and security policy of Russia, and since 1995 has had an active advisory role in Ukraine, working closely with the defense and security establishment. James, hello, and thank you so much to be with us today.
Спасибо за то, что нас сегодня я предпочитаю общаться на английском, потому что интеллектуального дисциплина нет на русском языке на сегодня. Да, спасибо за это уступка.
James, thank you so much. James, I know that you wrote a great, just brilliant article about Ukraine and Trump's world. And you know that Trump's come to White House next month. But now we know that Biden is leaving. And at the beginning of our interview, let's speak a little bit about the legacy of President Biden and his administration. What President Biden do right and what do wrong, and how you explain and understand the legacy of President Biden.
So let me offer an opinion at the beginning, which is not only mine. My expectations, the expectations of NATO, the expectations of Ukraine at the beginning of the Biden presidency were very high. I think that Biden was given an enormous opportunity to employ US power, to employ the unity of the alliance, first to deter the war, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine of February 2022, and secondly, after it occurred, to use power decisively to deny Russia its minimal objectives and confront Russia with a catastrophic defeat. And this was to use the terminology of the casino, this was a winning hand, and it was not properly played. And instead, the United States drifted into what Trump has called a forever war. And one of the consequences, inevitably, was the exhaustion, disillusionment of much of the American electorate and Donald Trump's victory. So what needs to be understood and what lessons need to be extracted from this? First, the so-called collective West, the Western liberal democracies, and I include Ukraine amongst this vast group, we are not simply challenged by competitors. We have adversaries, even enemies, противники и враги, not just competitors. We are not in a sporting competition. The United States and Japan were competitors in the 1970s. The United States and the EU have been competitors at many levels at many times. We are talking about adversaries. And we are living in a world of adversaries who are willing to employ military force and other heinous means and methods to produce real changes in the international environment that are contrary to our interests, and who are determined to actually do it unless they are stopped or unless they can be persuaded that their attempts will have ruinous consequences for themselves. And this needs to be understood. And not for the first time. Well, America is a superpower. America is great. America is very significant. And Americans have often, therefore, adopt the illusion of overestimating the power of their own voice, the power of their own moral visions, their own economic and military power. And they also have a habit in this vast world of politicians, advisors, and all the others, of talking to themselves. And Joseph Biden was trying to construct a framework for stable relations with Russia. But they weren't thinking about Russia. Russia was not interested in stability. Russia was not and is not interested in what Americans like to call improved relations. They wanted very specific changes. They spelt these changes out again and again and again. We want recognition of our rightful spheres of influence. We want NATO to return to its historical borders. We want all of the post-enlargement changes post-1997 to be reversed. We want it accepted that Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, is an extension of Russia and an extension of the Russian homeland, and something very special for us, and a number of other things. There was no mystery about this. And yet we kept acting as if there were other things we could talk about, other bargains that could be struck. Well, it's not so. Now, so there are adversaries. Second point that needs to be learned is that if you are going to deter war or prosecute war, you need to understand these adversaries. You need to understand their beliefs and understand they do have beliefs of their own, which come from their history, their civilization, not yours. These are not simple excuses or smokescreens for a desire to make profits and make money and all the rest of it, and to sit at this table rather than that table. They believe certain things that are not the same things we believe in. They have their own way of measuring power and strength and of assessing you. They know perfectly well, the Russians know perfectly well, that the scale of the Western economy is vastly larger than theirs, but the wars are not won by GDP comparisons. They are won by the conversion of national attributes, all of them, moral, economic, political, military, into usable power. And in this we have, we have not proved adequate. Our defense industry in the West is profoundly inadequate for the world in which we live and the challenges we face. It is a peacetime defense industry. And if we are going to deal with what more and more Western leaders and military officials call a pre-war period against real adversaries, we cannot do this with an industry or with armed forces that operate at peacetime scales and according to peacetime norms. And certainly during the Biden years, no serious steps were taken to address this. It's now very late. Now we face a problem, and Ukrainians need to understand it. It's not simply that the problem arising from, it's not simply that we do not wish to give Ukraine much of the military equipment it needs. We no longer have this equipment available because we have exhausted so much that was immediately available. Now, this would not have been the case even 2 years ago, but it is now. So the collective West needs to reorganize itself. And then what is also needed, we cannot afford again, and this is something that Americans have done more than once, we cannot afford to go to war without a strategy. There needs to be a very clear definition of what the ends are. What do we mean by victory? What are we trying to achieve? And on the basis of those ends, and on the basis of the second thing you need, a correct evaluation of your opponent's objectives and what he's willing to do, then you devise the means that are appropriate. And we have lost that strategic approach. And it needs to be there. And it needs to be very, very rigorous. And in a democracy, it needs to be explained to people, not through slogans and platitudes. So these are, Biden is not uniquely at fault. You can look at a number of military conflicts that the West and the United States in particular have participated in. During the Cold War and after it, I mean, going back to the Vietnam War, where many of the same points could have been made, which failed for very similar reasons. So forgive my long answer.
No, it's great. James, I prepare one big question about Trump for you. Yeah. We know that Trump wants to end this war. And how can it be ended? I mean, this war. What can be the stage? What are the red lines for Trump and for West?
Well, it's fine for me to sit here and say it, but I'm not the president of the United States. So let me say a couple of things about him. He and his people, both his more experienced and professional advisors and his more ideological and emotional supporters, they understand that Biden's policy failed. I am not convinced that they are in any way equipped to draw lessons from these failures. Trump, as you say, and it's true, he wants to end this war quickly. He said many times in his campaign, I will end it in 24 hours. Well, he knew it wouldn't be 24 hours, but I sincerely believe that even now he believes he can end it in a couple of months, or at least stop it. And one thing I think you, I, and 90% of people listening to this discussion know is this war is not going to end in a few weeks or months. I don't think Donald Trump yet knows that. So the question is, what is going to happen when he realizes he can't do this? Now, that's the key question, but you have to put this now in a context about who he is. This is a man who, unique amongst all American presidents, I would say since 1945, has no bond, no affection to the institutions and the values that define the West, that make the West the West. His view of the world is completely transactional. It's a view of the world he doesn't understand, doesn't recognize belief systems, scales of values, any of this. What he understands is money. What he understands is bargaining, negotiation, deal making. And we had a recent example of this in a positive way, I think. Some of you will have noticed that Trump has, now publicly said that he expects NATO, which has had difficulty, at least many NATO allies have had difficulty meeting a 2% target for defense spending. We expect NATO, he is saying, if you want the United States to continue to support NATO, we expect NATO countries to pay 5% of their devote 5% of their GDP to defense. Okay, this is, by the way, a very silly way of calculating what a country needs for defense, but there it is, it's understandable. But immediately he said that, you could see that between the lines he was willing to accept maybe 3.5%. But his whole approach to deal making is, well, you ask for twice what you want, and then you get something that you can both agree on. Then you have a deal. And then if you have a deal, you have good relations because you have a deal. And if you violate the deal, then you have bad relations. Now, this is the way he thinks about everything. And this is the way he thinks about Xi Jinping. This is the way he thinks about Vladimir Putin. I don't think he's in love with Putin. I certainly don't think that he is in some way influenced by Putin. He is not Putin's man. He is his own man. He's nobody's man. But he does not yet understand. I think he even understands less of it than Biden did, that Russia is an adversary. It's not just a competitor. It's not just a problem. It's an adversary. And it's going to remain one as long as the West is a meaningful entity. He doesn't understand that yet. Is he capable of understanding that? I don't know. So the question then is the following. When he discovers, as he will, that he cannot end this war quickly, that Russia is not going to make concessions or change its mode of behavior or be more conciliatory or be more flexible just because Trump is there. It's not going to happen. The Russians have made it clear. When he discovers this, when he discovers the Russians don't want to stop fighting. And of course they don't, because fighting the war is the only leverage Russia has. Ukraine doesn't need to be fighting, but Russia needs to be fighting. War is once again Russia's vocation. But even if you leave that aside, that this is a воюющая страна, even if you leave that aside, fighting is the only means of leverage Russia has in this war to get concessions of the kind it wants from the West and from Ukraine. So it has no incentive to stop fighting. If they are going to agree to a ceasefire, they have to be forced to agree. That means Ukraine cannot do this on its own. That means the West must do this. And that means the United States must do this. And when Donald Trump reaches the point where he understands that, what is he going to do? I don't know. He has threatened once or twice. He has said if Putin won't stop fighting, I'll give Ukraine everything more than they ever have had. Will he? I don't know. He is equally capable of just putting more pressure on Zelensky. Zelensky will say, I can make all the concessions you want, except one. I cannot abandon Ukrainian statehood. No Ukrainian president, no real Ukrainian president could do that. Putin will first have to install a president who will do that. No president that comes from this country, from here, will do that. Won't be able to survive. Does Trump understand that? No, I don't think so. So he'll try to put pressure on Zelensky. Well, what's going to happen when he realizes, as I said, there is no quick end to this war? He might, as I said, suddenly become very tough with Putin to end the war, or he might just walk away. And Ukrainians who, from what I can see in Ukrainian commentary, it's rather optimistic about Trump, I would say, maybe far too optimistic about Trump. I think Ukrainians need to take more seriously the possibility that Donald Trump just might walk away. Now, what would prevent him from walking away? To influence Donald Trump, you have to respond to his interests, his objectives. The fact that the humanitarian consequences of this would be unprecedented, that's not going to influence him if he decides to walk away. The fact that trust in the United States, belief in the United States, in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Finland, Sweden, and half of Europe will disappear. That might or that might not influence him. Somehow people will have to explain to him that if this happens, the consequences for the US position in the world, not just in Eastern Europe, not just in Ukraine, will be catastrophic. The Japanese need to persuade him of this. The Taiwanese need to persuade him of that. I'm not sure, by the way, how committed he even is to the defense of Taiwan. I don't know. He has to understand that the consequences of this will mean political disaster, not only geopolitical disaster for the United States, but a political disaster for him. Is it possible to persuade him of that? Is it possible to make that argument? I think so. But that's the argument that has to be made. An argument on the basis of principle, morality, is not going to do anything. Even if I were to say to him, as I would, if you do this, Ukrainians will hate the United States for a generation, and at least half of Europe will distrust it and probably hate it for a whole generation, and you will get nothing there from them. That might influence him, it might not, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough. Someone also needs to point out to him what we failed to do in the first term, 2016 to 2020. Just what the United States gains from having NATO. All they think about is, we are paying NATO's bills. Well, this is nonsensical on many levels. But the United States, I mean, imagine it would be as if the United States has all these assets, all this territory on which they can base forces, which they can base their own special facilities, in which they also have allies who cooperate with them to do things they cannot do entirely on their own. And in fact, they pay very little for it, because most of the US defense budget does not go on NATO, it goes on other things. we could get into a situation, and it must be the task of Europe, in my view, to put itself in such a situation, where we do everything Trump wants. We spend all this money on defense. We conduct a strategic reorganization of our defense capability, our means of producing armament, our means of mobilization. We change our structure and put ourselves in a position where, to a considerable extent, Europe on its own can not only support Ukraine, but prevent Russia from getting what it wants. We have to do this ourselves, and in such a way we can say to the Americans, fine, we've done what you've asked, but we will now do what we want, not what you want. You are not in charge here anymore. All of this needs to be communicated, but it has to be backed by real efforts, not by the kind of eloquence we hear from certain European capitals that is not accompanied by real hard material efforts. So, yes, in one of the articles you read, I laid out a plan for what I think ought to happen that maybe Trump could accept, but it doesn't make sense for me to spell that out here, because I will not be making these decisions. And people like me will not be making these decisions. At least when Biden was in power, we had the illusion that there are lots of people in this administration we could talk to and influence. I'm not sure to what extent that's true now. We'll know more I think we'll know more within about a month after he's elected. We will see just exactly who we can talk to. I knew in the past, by the way, I don't mind your audience knowing this, I'm sure they knew this. When I wrote various things, there were certain well-placed friends of mine who would put this through the system, both the administration, other permanent people. I don't mean everywhere, but certain channels. So certain things would be read. Maybe not all of it was read, but I know a lot of it was read. It doesn't mean that people like myself had any real influence. We had some. But now I know this feeling, we don't quite know who's there. We don't quite know what channels work, how long they will stay open. We're living in an environment of real uncertainty at the moment, which is why I said to you, let's have another discussion after the Trump administration has really bedded down and we can understand exactly who and what we are dealing with.
James, thank you so much for being with us today. And I very hope to have a next conversation maybe in January or maybe in February better, to know what people will be in your administration of Trump.
Did I miss anything you wanted, any more ground you wanted to cover, or is that basically, have we reached the limits of what I can usefully and intelligently say this afternoon? Maybe I have.
James, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year.
S Novim Godom.